Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Learn how to get a tenant to pay you the rent, even if they've lost their job, real estate versus stocks, and then more guidance for real estate investors during these exceptional times. Finally, learn how current events have altered the mortgage lending landscape for real estate investors with a great guest today on Get Rich Education. Finally, with Total Control Financial, get checkbook control of your existing 401k and IRA funds to invest in real estate. Yes, you can move your retirement money into your own checking account, but you must avoid the little-known tax that you'll get hammered with in a self-directed IRA. Instead, start your QRP. Learn more and get your free copy of the QRP book by text messaging QRP in all capital letters to 72,000.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. If you're concerned that you have tenants that may not be able to pay the rent due to losing their job or some other reason, I've got a 10-step plan that will substantially increase the chances that you get paid. So go ahead and try these 10 steps in this order. Number one is that depending on whether you use a professional property manager or not, start with the mindset of proactivity rather than passivity. In this case, this is going to make you feel better because you'll know you've done what you could. The second step is to commit. Have a written plan, because making decisions on the fly usually results in bad decisions being made. So step 3 is empathy. Reach out to the tenant and just see how it's going without even bringing up the hint of a potential problem. If the tenant has indeed lost their job and their income, show some compassion. Nobody could have seen this coming. Find out if they plan to pay the full rent amount on time. Step number 4 is iterate that they must pay. So let them know that. Maybe put it this way and say, I know that a payment default often hurts one's credit score and appears on their court record. Remind them that you're not a billion-dollar corporation. Many tenants really don't even know that you have a mortgage to pay. If your tenant does know about an eviction moratorium, tell them that that won't last. Now, I've heard of a few investors showing so much empathy that they're letting their tenants just flat out skip a month of paying. That is a kind act. That is rare. And not everyone is in a situation to do that. Number 5 is provide payment options. Give them options. If they don't have the cash, tell them that they can pay by credit card. And now might be a good time for you to set up a credit-based rent collection system. Anyway, platforms like PayPal, Venmo, Appfolio, Buildium, and Cozy can all handle this for you. Consider paying the credit card fees for them. That demonstrates that you're working with them. If this fails, tell them that they can borrow from a family member. So these are examples of options that you can provide them. Number 6 out of 10 has to do with the late fee. To provide more empathy for their situation, consider waiving the late fee for them if they happen to be late. If these things still haven't worked, we get down to number 7, installments. If the tenant still cannot pay the full rent amount, then ask, how much can you pay? And I don't particularly like installments myself, but these are rare times. 8th is the security deposit. If you've come this far and you still need to get some leverage, consider applying the security deposit toward the rent. And note again that this is poor guidance under normal circumstances. The 9th step is assistance. Tell your tenant to stay up to date with government programs that are offering financial aid. They can Google things like rental assistance program or unemployment or free government $1,200 check and so on. And then the 10th and the final step is to document this, track what you've agreed to, and make it a temporary addendum to the rental agreement. Because if you don't do that, then it just kind of sets an anything goes climate between you and your residents. So these 10 steps can increase the chances of timely rent payments until the pandemic blows over. So you're leading with proactivity, empathy, providing options, and letting honesty guide you here. If you use a property manager, you might share some of these ideas with them, but they probably already heard a lot of them already. Now, if you self-manage and you only have a few tenants, well, then a phone call might be a good idea. If you're in an area where evictions are still allowable and legal, and you got to note that many are suspended during this pandemic, remember that courts may be closed. So you want to check before you get too aggressive on evictions here during this exceptional period of time. If you yourself have difficulty paying your mortgages, you can tell your lender that you need loan forbearance. Banks understand that a lot of people are experiencing this need right now. We're going to talk about this more and just what this means with our guest later. Most areas have a freeze on both evictions and foreclosures, but note that some tenants don't know about eviction postponement. They're probably just not as well informed as you. Now, it's still a little hard to believe how this pandemic came out of left field. This is not a convenient situation for us or for any world citizen. You might hear some people call it a black swan event. That just means it's an unpredictable or an unforeseen event. There's a little good news in all this. Springtime is a popular season for tenants to move out in general, and this spring might be different. Property management companies tell me that more residents are signing lease renewals than those that are giving notices to vacate. Residents want to feel a sense of security at this time, but they need to pay the rent. This past week, I've talked to more real estate, companies and parties than perhaps any week of my life in order to get updated on what they see. I've been talking to property providers and agents and property managers and mortgage loan officers and fellow investors too. Talking with one property management company with 500 units in their portfolio, they have guessed that 20% of residents won't pay the next month's rent on time, and there's usually just 5 to 10% under normal circumstances. Investors that have a high proportion of tenants with a government subsidy like Section 8 housing could be in a better position right now. But you, as an investor, you do have some time to react here, like helping ensure that your tenants can pay the rent because real estate is a slow-moving vehicle. Look at the shock market, also known as the stock market. Investors had no time to react, and they lost 10 or 20 or 30% of their capital value so fast. And many of those shock market investors, they only have one way to win. They're hoping for growth in capital value. And when your only way to profit is to buy low and sell high, and then this happens, you're really hurting. And actually, what's happened in the stock market recently, it brilliantly demonstrates that deleterious effect of volatility to your portfolio. If your stock is worth $100 and it goes down 10%, you're down to $90. The next day, if it goes up 10%, now your 90 only goes up to $99. So even though it went down 10% one day and up 10% the next, most people think they broke even. Well, you know that your $100 got whittled down to $99. That's just math, and that kind of stuff has been happening a lot lately. Not only is real estate more stable, but real estate is more in your control, and stocks are more out of your control. But one thing you've got to keep in mind for both types of investor is that a pandemic like this is often outside of your understanding, no matter what you invest in. It's a threat that you can't quite see, And I think that's one reason that some people have defied stay-at-home orders or suggestions. Many times when they go out in public, their actions risk other people's lives. Well, when drunk drivers drive, their actions risk others' lives and they get cited for that. They get fined or jailed. The fact that the threat here is invisible and intangible, I think that's what makes some people underestimate it. Look, if the threat were highly visible, like a 100-meter tall Godzilla that was stomping around and crushing buildings and swatting helicopters out of the air and breathing fire that burnt people's heads off, that's a visible threat, and that would make people stay at home. COVID-19 may be as great of a threat, but it's just a threat that you can't see. It can cause permanent lung damage in people that aren't even all that old. So don't let the fact that something is invisible make you put other people at risk. And I'm sorry that Godzilla example got a little graphic there. So getting back to some real estate solutions, you've got all these vacant hotels and Airbnbs now because no one is traveling. I think that it makes sense to take some of these vacant hotels and convert them into hospitals. And then Airbnbs, they could be filled with people that prefer to self-quarantine. Now, what do I mean? Well, I'm a perfect example of possibly wanting to self-quarantine. Like I mentioned before, my wife is a medical worker and I'm afraid she's going to come home with the virus. So I actually think about self-isolating and renting out one of these many Airbnb units that are vacant right now. So there's a real estate repurposing taking place right now with some certain types. Cruise ships and convention centers are increasingly being used as makeshift hospitals. Now, when it comes to residential investment property, some people have asked me what I think they should do if they're in contract now, like they made an offer on a property in the last few weeks and it hasn't closed yet. I'd ask yourself where the current tenant's income comes from and where future tenants' income would likely come from. For example, you wouldn't seek a place with a tenant that's highly likely to work at a restaurant or a small retailer because a lot of those businesses operate on smaller margins and they could be out of business after this crisis. But think about the business sectors that are hiring lots of people right now. It's those large retailers that are hiring. Amazon, Walmart, Instacart, many grocery chains and manufacturers and the medical industry. That is resilient stuff. So buying today places even more emphasis than before on where that tenant income originates. This is a risk that can be managed. Generally speaking, this is a most unique crisis in our lifetimes. Consider that it's a hit to both health and wealth at the same time. It's also a hit to both supply and demand at the same time. That's different from the global financial crisis. In fact, we might very well call this time the Great Shutdown, and we all hope that it's short-lived. How has this changed the lending landscape for residential rental properties? That's next with a great guest. I'm Keith Weinhold. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Property investors can get killed with maintenance costs. That's less likely when you buy brand new construction. Let me tell you about JWB Real Estate Capital in bustling Jacksonville, Florida. They pioneered the build-to-rent model where you can invest in new construction, turnkey rental property. That's why JWB was featured on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. To learn more and see inventory, start now at newconstructionturnkey.com. The company that's provided our listeners with more loans than anyone is Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. You can finance more than 10 single families up to fourplexes. Serving most U.S. states, their knowledge and experience leads to your financial freedom. They're number one in the investment space. Pre-qualify and then chat with President Caeli Ridge personally. Start on your next investment property loan right now at ridgelendinggroup.com.
This is Richard Duncan, publisher of Macro Watch. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, and don't quit your daydream.
Your favorite slack-jawed act is back on track here. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. I sure hope you enjoyed partying in your living room last weekend with your family or by yourself. And hey, there's no cover charge there at Club Pandemic, so hopefully you're reinventing yourself. Over the years, you've probably heard so many people say things like, oh, I just like to spend more time with my family, or I wish that weekend could have lasted longer, or you hear something like, I sure wish I could find the time to exercise. Well, maybe now you have time to do those things. And yes, indeed, the best realtor line that I've heard lately is, can you see yourself being quarantined in this house? Yes, truly a sign of the times. And I'm trying really hard to keep things light during a time like this. Let's learn about how current events have shaped the mortgage lending environment and how you might adjust. As the president of Ridge Lending Group, this week's guest has spent the last 20 years as a nationwide lender and loan officer. In fact, the company she leads, Ridge Lending Group, has helped more people realize their financial freedom through real estate than any other mortgage lender in America. And she's probably done more loans for you, the Get Rich Education listener, than any lender anywhere in the world. In fact, it's where I do my loans. The mortgage that I originated on the last few investment property loans that I took out myself was with them. It's great to have back Ridge Lending Group President Caeli Ridge.
I am always delighted to be here, Keith. Thank you for having me.
Caeli, you were last with us less than 2 months ago, but a lot of things have changed in the world. So give us an overview of the mortgage market condition and what we might call the new normal, though it's still evolving.
Yes, absolutely. I think that I, for one, could never have predicted that we would be having some of these conversations today. Much has changed, lots of updates to share. So the current state of affairs related to mortgages, lending, as it applies to your listeners and investors, some of the biggest differences in the last couple of months have been some elimination of product. Business as usual is a very different playing field today.
Yeah.
Particularly two product types. One is jumbo. Jumbo loans are not being secured right now. They're completely suspended industry-wide. I should mention the changes that I'll kind of go over today. They're not particular just to Ridge. This is an industry-wide update. So jumbo loans, which are equal to, I think the amount is $765,600. That number and above are considered jumbo loans. Those are no longer available for the consumer. And the other one, and this was kind of a big one, and this will affect some investors, the non-QM products. If anyone has heard me talk before, lots of times on your show, Keith, I'll just quickly define non-QM. QM stands for qualified mortgage. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac loans, conventional loans, are defined as qualified mortgages. So really everything outside of that particular box or underwriting box of guidelines is now non-QM. So this will be for investors that maybe can't fit into the Fannie Freddie box. Maybe you have exhausted your 10 golden tickets, as we call them, those Fannie Freddie loans, and you want to keep buying residential real estate and secure 30-year fixed. You would apply in the non-QM space. For those different product types, non-QM is also gone, eradicated, done. There are no fundings anywhere in the country for non-QM loan products. I am unclear as of the moment whether this is a temporary thing or a permanent thing. Those details have not yet been shared with me. So those are the two biggest things that we've seen happen over the last several weeks.
Right. So that's the evaporation of jumbo loans and non-QM loans. We're talking about 1 to 4 unit investment properties. Now that space where if you wanted to get more than 10 of those properties single or more than 20 married, that market has gone away.
Correct.
Tell us about some of the other major changes and perhaps the why behind those.
A lot of the bigger changes started with lack of liquidity and then really capacity. Let me share an example about the capacity part first. Annually, we will see in the mortgage industry, anywhere from $3 to $5 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities being underwritten and funded. In the span of just under 30 days, when everybody saw the interest rates fall through the floor, the amount of applications that came flooding into the mortgage industry totaled just under $1.3 trillion. And that was under a 30-day period of time.
Gosh.
So think about that. Yeah. So when I say capacity, that probably resonates that just simply there's no way that the industry could have fulfilled that kind of demand. So that coupled with some liquidity issues kind of set things spinning. And then the progression, coronavirus fears have continued and secondary markets and stock markets have all led to further change that has created a lot of what we're finding in interest rates today. Credit requirements, underwriting guidelines are starting to get a little bit stricter, and it will continue. I mean, everybody's hearing the sound bites out there and some of the news. Unemployment is going to be a significant part of this discussion and conversation in the defaults that it's going to create. It feels kind of like a Rubik's Cube, if that's a good analogy. You know, every time we turn it this way, we think we've got a solution here, something else comes up over there. But I think that there's a lot of smart people out there that are making the decisions that need to be made to kind of ease a little bit. I think that the foreseeable future, we've got some challenges, but big picture stuff, and big picture, let's call it a month or 2 months, which is going to feel like an eternity to some of us. But yeah, I do see this starting to level out.
Before we talk more about interest rates, are there any substantial changes in the form of some of those more traditional criteria that are necessary for qualifying for a loan, like credit score, debt to income ratio, or any specifics with employment verification standards with all this unemployment now?
Nothing officially has been written. It's really going to be more on an individual lending basis. It has not been delivered directly from the Fannie Freddie. But here's what I can tell you that seems to be sort of across the board. One thing in particular that I think you will find everywhere is the last minute VOE, which is verification of employment. With the high rate of unemployment that we're seeing, and in the industries in particular that have been hit so hard with this, the restaurant, the entertainment, the airline, right, those industries,
right.
Last minute VOEs are being conducted. And I mean right up until the minute they're hitting the button to send the wire out to make sure that the employment is still valid in there. So that's been happening. For those individuals that will or have been so greatly impacted in the industries that I just mentioned, it will probably be harder for them to secure financing. I believe that there's probably a lot of lenders that will not fund loans for individuals that are in one of those industries right now.
Certain industries, yeah, that makes sense. And it does make sense from the lender and underwriter perspective, given today's climate, that they would check on a verification of employment right before funding the loan. Let's talk about interest rates. They bottomed out about 3 weeks ago. They're still extremely low, of course. And what some people don't understand is there are a few factors on interest rates. For starters, the federal funds rate is a smaller factor on what one's interest rate will be. The yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury note is a greater factor on what long-term mortgage interest rates are going to be. But then there's often a third reason which could point to why rates are a bit higher than what some of those indicators point to. Tell us about that.
So first of all, I would say that anything that we would normally use as our benchmark, a barometer to kind of predict or see where rates are going to go, just throw it away, throw it out the window. Anything that would have been valid 3-4+ weeks ago isn't really going to be relevant right now. Quickly, let me explain the difference between the Fed fund rate and as that is in relation to the long-term mortgage rate. A lot of people confuse those two things, thinking they're one and the same, which has been a little problematic. The Fed fund rate, for those that are not aware, is the interest rate that banks use to trade on daily. Okay, really is not connected to the 30-year fixed. Now, their interest rates, so they have some connection, but when one moves, the other doesn't automatically move, and it doesn't automatically mean that they go lower, right? Example, when the Feds reduced the Fed fund rate, long-term rates actually went up. The other thing that we're seeing is that with so much demand, in addition to a variety of other variables, it's important to comment, it's almost unlimited, the number of variables that play a role. The artificial inflation of interest rates right now is really necessary. We have to be able to move the pipelines that have been in, get them off balance sheets, get liquidity back and working before they can start reducing interest rates back down to where we expect them to go. Because if they were to drop through the floor again, we're going to find ourselves in the same position that we've been in the last 3 and 4 weeks. So it'll be a slower progression. And by slower, I think I mentioned a second ago, a month, maybe 2 months. I'm hopeful end of April is when we'll start to see some normalcy. But for interest rates, I would expect people to kind of look at them as artificially inflated. But let me be clear about that. People have short memories, I find. I'm guilty of this myself.
Sure.
5% interest rate on a 30-year fixed mortgage or 5.5% on an investment property for 30 years is an incredibly low interest rate. So I caution people not to get too hung up on where we are today. Those are still very, very good rates.
And the federal funds rate comes out as an announcement. The yield on the 10-year Treasury note, if you're going to follow that, you're probably going to have a favorites website where you go ahead and check on that. That bounces around substantially more than the federal funds rate does, where the federal funds rate typically stays at one level for months until it changes. Talk to us about forbearance, Caeli. I think a lot of investors know that there's a moratorium on evictions in a lot of markets, and there also might be one on forbearance, which basically means that your loan payments are postponed. Tell us about that.
This is a rather new announcement from Fannie Freddie, the GSEs, government-sponsored entities, Ginnie Mae, that kind of thing. We're still waiting for some specific clarity, but as it is today, what we're being told is for landlords, particularly with tenants that are not able to make that rent payment on time, there will be some sort of forbearance for the landlord, assuming that the eviction process is not started. How this is going to affect credit, how it's going to be repaid, I believe right now what they're telling us is it'll simply be added to the end of the loan. They're not going to break it up into re-amortized payments over the remaining life of the loan. I do not believe that's going to be the case. If that happens, let's just say as an example, you're able to miss 2 mortgage payments as a result of the tenant not being able to make their rent payment. That amount will be added to the balance of your loan so that upon refinance or sale at any point, those amounts will be due. As it applies to the individual's credit, now this has been a big question and I do not have answers to this yet. We have calls into both Fannie and Freddie to get clarity, but I am unclear right now how it could impact the individual's need to get financing while that might be happening, right? If they're refinancing or purchasing something and they have not made a mortgage payment over here, given the forbearance allowance, I'm not exactly sure how that's going to impact their ability to qualify otherwise.
Gosh, there are so many fast-moving situations here, and lending is already a pretty dynamic part of the industry, and things are changing even more now. Now, beyond forbearance, we think of a term that really became, unfortunately, somewhat popularized coming out of the Great Recession and global financial crisis of about 12 years ago, and that is loan modification, which is more substantial than forbearance. It's where your loan terms are altered pretty substantially. Tell us your thoughts about loan modification. Or any lenders willing to do that yet? Are we there yet?
I don't think we're there yet. I am able to confirm what it is from a qualifying perspective. Let's say that you got a loan modification. Right now, for qualifying, anyone that had a loan modification would be treated the same as a short sale, and the term or time in which would have to pass from that action would be 4 years before you could qualify for a new conventional loan. That's how the underwriting guidelines are written today. Subject to change, certainly, but I have not heard too much about modification as a means of relief for what might be going on with the individual situation and ability to make that mortgage payment.
Right. That might be next if that ever happens. Loan modification, meaning where someone would lower your interest rate or even slash off a substantial chunk of your principal balance, like it's something that we saw back 12 years ago in the Great Recession. So we're not there yet if we ever get there with loan modification. We just still have a lot of unknowns with how long this crisis is going to be with us, and is going to be a substantial factor in the life of everyday people and people being able to get back to work. So is there anything else with the recent changes that a prospective investor and borrower should know, Caeli?
I would just anticipate a couple things. That the individual should be ready to see higher qualification needs to qualify. You had mentioned this earlier, and I didn't necessarily touch on it. So credit score requirements, maybe it goes to a 700 minimum. Maybe the debt to income ratio threshold goes to 43%, extra assets required, which I would say that the vast majority of investors that we work with anyway are well and above those thresholds. So I don't see a huge impact to the investor and what their qualification needs are going to be. But other than that, Keith, I might just offer a few thoughts. There's going to be a lot of opportunity out there, guys. And there is actually now a lot of opportunity that I'm seeing. Still a huge number of purchase contracts coming in. I'm seeing sometimes the buyers now are able to negotiate a little bit in certain areas of the country and the price points because the homeowners aren't out there doing as much purchasing for themselves, which in turn opens up the rental pool, right? Homeowners, if they're not purchasing, they got to find somewhere to live. So the rental pool is starting to become a little bit more robust. So that's a good thing. But beyond any of that, I would tell people that might be sitting on the fence, now is not the time to hesitate. Whatever you end up doing, get prepared. Get your pre-qualification financial ducks in a row, ideally with Ridge Lending Group, of course. But whomever you're banking with, go ahead and get everything ready. If you have any intention to purchase or refinance this year, get all of that work behind you so that you are ready to pull the trigger, to lock in an interest rate at a moment's notice if it becomes desirable or optimal. That's my biggest takeaway or piece of advice I'm giving my clients right now.
Yeah, they say scared money doesn't make any money. I've talked to quite a few turnkey providers in the last week or so to get a temperature on the climate of buyers. And among those that are in contract, 9 out of 10 want to stay in contract. Only 1 out of 10 have fallen out for whatever reason. And there certainly are plenty of new buyers there to scoop up that one property out of 10 that falls out of contract.
Yeah, we're seeing something very similar. Very, very little of what our purchase pipeline is doing is canceling. So we're not seeing too much fall off there. Refinances are still going through. I do think that there's some that are kind of holding a minute just to see how rates will change over the coming days and weeks. So far, it's business as usual for us. Ridge is not experiencing any capacity issues whatsoever. There are delays, I will mention, in a few different sectors. One being the appraisal for different reasons. One, fear-based, right? Tenants are a little bit apprehensive about letting appraisers in to inspect. Appraisers aren't wanting to go in. So that, and then also on the other side, closing, right? Notaries and kind of that social distancing thing. But we're getting through it relatively unscathed, I would say.
The masked appraiser. Yeah, don't know how that's going to work. So we've talked about the climate up to this point. What do you see happening next? What's your forecast for lending and housing?
I think housing is going to remain strong. I think that there's obviously in any conversation, past, present, or future, there's going to be both sides to the aisle. But I am very bullish about housing. I think lending also will see some changes, but I think that those are going to be, any of the negative impact is really going to be for the more marginally qualified borrower, right? The 620 or 640 credit scores, the down payment assistance programs, the ones that have more risk for default. I'm bullish in both ways. I think that lending is going to continue to be strong. I think we've got a lot of positivity there with interest rates. Just be prepared. And I think housing is also going to maintain its legs and continue to be strong for many, many years to come.
Interest rates are fantastic right now, and your 30-year fixed amortizing loan is going to substantially outlive the pandemic. So that's the good news. It's great interest rates, but expect higher qualification standards. There could be delays, and please keep in mind that we have a moving target. Caeli, the best thing for one to do is to get pre-qualified. Tell them the best way for them to do that.
Reach out, guys. You can find us on the web at www.ridgelendinggroup.com. You can reach us via email, info@ridgelendinggroup.com, or you can call us toll-free at 855-747-4343. Again, 855-74-RIDGE is that easy way to remember. We look forward to receiving you.
You would be hard-pressed to deal with any lender that has more experience originating income property loans than Ridge. Start there. Caeli Ridge, it's been great having you back on the show.
Thanks, Keith.
Look, this is not the world's first crisis, though it may end up being the biggest one in recent memory. At some point, it will be history. Your life will go on, the world will go on, commerce will continue, and people will need real estate to live, work, and play inside. As we've seen in this crisis, it's residential real estate that's become even more important to people. It's really become the center of people's lives more than ever. And if everyday residential real estate is in trouble, workforce housing, then essentially everything would be in trouble. I think the crisis will be with us for a while longer, but realize that at one point we thought HIV and AIDS was incurable and a death sentence, and then some wonderful scientists discovered antiviral drugs. So over and over again, history is replete with examples that human ingenuity does find a way. There will be a turning point, and when people see things improving, stocks will start to rise, and people's confidence in real estate will rise too. You can't make any money from the property that you don't own, so if you're looking for recession-resilient real estate, get pre-qualified. Get started by finding investment property at greturnkey.com. Remember, for a while longer, we can all ultimately come together by temporarily staying apart. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.